Listening to the relentless wave of masculinity commentators and influencers online, one thing becomes clear.
We need to make men be men again.
Be a man. Men need to be men.
My idea of masculinity growing up was a man who was in control of himself. I watched like a lot of Westerns.
We're getting soft. Yeah. We're getting weak.
Very rarely do I meet a guy in his 20s that I think if I punched him in the face, he'd actually punch me back. That's a freaking problem.
Men need to be men again. But what men are we talking about here? I think the most iconic images of American history created by Hollywood make that clear. The rugged cowboy, the patriotic soldier, and the successful 1950s husband. Each one of these masculine figureheads points to a way of being an American man that many think we should strive to find our way back to. And the celebration of these ideal masculine archetypes is so saturated into American culture that celebration goes far beyond just conservative traditionalists. But what if I told you that these iconic American images of masculinity are a lie? I have been waiting 8 years to make this video. It's the idea that spent the longest amount of time on my ongoing video ideas list, but I could never quite make it work. Except over the last 8 years, something has been changing, growing, evolving even. And all of a sudden, the video feels depressingly relevant. Modern American masculinity is apparently in crisis, and finding the answers in America's past is big business. Thought leaders, influencers, political commentators from everywhere, from the Red Pill forums to the Manosphere podcast to the MAGA hat rallies, point to the traditional masculinity of the past as the solution. I mean, these are the men that created this nation and formed it into the greatest country on earth. It worked for them, so it should work for us, right? The country we think of as the United States of America does not have its own traditional mythology. Now, the indigenous people living across the landmass do, of course, but the modern nation of the US does not. And by that I mean it doesn't have stories from thousands of years ago about the founding of its culture. It doesn't have legendary heroes who encounter supernatural beings. It doesn't have larger-than-life tales that are passed down to teach moral lessons. The United States is too new for that. It's made up of too many people coming from older cultures whose homeland myths are set far away. But it does have its own type of modern mythology. A modern mythology which has had a profound impact on Americans' concept of their own nation. And that is the world of movies. Hollywood becomes the storyteller around the campfire, and movies create a unifying narrative about American history, which serves to give the American public a mythology of their modern nation. In the same way myths are told and retold and changed and shared and reformed, Hollywood genres build on existing ideas, values, and stereotypes to create a crystallization of American history and identity. The Odyssey becomes the Western. The Iliad becomes the war movie. Myths are more than just fun stories, right? Throughout the history of humanity, they take the shape of lessons we must learn, history we shouldn't forget, and stories that confirm the types of people who are important. They give us the best of men and the worst of monsters. And they're often preoccupied with the act of creation, how a nation or people came to be. Because these historical American movies are not just envisioning a mythologized creation of America, populated by real American men. They're enforcing the idea that America itself, both then and now, is not possible without these kinds of men. Hollywood has retrospectively created its own version of American history, and in doing so has laid the credit for the greatest nation on earth firmly at the feet of the ultimate movie hero, white American men. In turn, they've crystallized the benchmark for white American masculinity and the demand that they live up to the fictionalized heroes of old. The implication of all of this being that white American men are still the stewards of a successful America, especially if they adhere to the right ideas of masculinity. And so, today, I want us to go on a journey together through the movie mythology of modern America to see what it can teach us about this modern masculinity crisis. The ideal of the Western hero. The swaggering gunslinger, the gruff hero riding into the sunset on his trusty steed, the slick tilt of a cowboy hat. The heroes of the Western movie genre are possibly the most iconic image of traditional American masculinity that exists. These men are cool, powerful, in control. They're an ideal to be lived up to. A demonstration of how America used to be.
We get something out of mob movies and cowboy movies. We get something about seeing the rugged individual go up against the bad guys and triumph. But if you don't make any of that product anymore, then things pop up, like Andrew Tate. He's a pimp. And suddenly people are drawn to that. because that pimp is speaking for young disenfranchised men.
The long-standing veneration of Western heroes reveals how many American men view their collective past, but also how they see themselves as naturally connected to these past heroes. The identity of white American man being something real and lasting, enough to tie together the heroes of the 1800s with the modern demographic, despite the differences in the eras and experiences of the two. I have been thinking about and theorizing around this whole imagined connection for a long time now, as you can probably tell with how long it took me to make this video, and especially the implications of mistaking myth for reality. And so when I started reading this book called Six Guns and Society by Will Wright, you can imagine my moment of pure vindication when I read this. It is through the movies that the myth has become part of the cultural language by which America understands itself. Because yes, that's exactly what I've been saying. The fiction and the history and the legend and the myth are all flattened into one fantastical truth. But that supposed truth is not a frivolous bedtime story, right? It is fundamental to how traditional American masculinity has been constructed, affirmed, and enforced over the years. So what does that vision of masculinity actually look like specifically? Well, let's break it down. Before we dive in, I just want to thank today's sponsor. They're back, supporting the channel. It's Balesa. Welcome to the part of the video where I, an asexual lesbian, unironically tell you about sex toys. That's right, Balesa and I are teaming up yet again, and this time they're offering everyone who signs up via my link a free rose suction toy with their order. In case you're somehow unfamiliar, Balesa are a by women for everyone sexual wellness brand that focuses on allowing you all to embrace and explore your sexuality without shame or stress. Their toys are made from medical grade body-safe silicone, come in charging cases that are discreet, and are travel friendly. They sent me some of their products to give to my mates, and let me remind you of some of the rave reviews that I got in return. Oh yeah, that's Rumbly, like deep whiskey voiced lesbian Rumbly. Oh my god, I've been using the same one for about 10 years. My fave, my ride or die. But this has replaced it, I fear. That was unreal. And finally, who knew that vibes took estrogen? That was so soft. This was, I would like to emphasize, before I agreed to work with Balesa. I asked for these peer reviews to decide whether they would be a good fit for the channel, and the testimonials from my friends were very persuasive. There are a lot of options depending on what suits you, so you might have actually seen the rose toy I just mentioned going viral on TikTok. It fits easily in the palm of one hand and has 10 different settings for precise control. Or there's the Pebble with suction and vibration controlled independently without those annoying like pattern modes that saw like broken Christmas lights. Or maybe you prefer the Air Vibe with dual stimulation. Yep, quiet as a whisper and waterproof too. Look, I don't know what you people are up to when you're not watching my videos. And hey, no judgment, I just did this entire ad read dressed as a cowboy, So if you want to grab yourself a free rose suction toy with your order, sign up via the link in the description. Back to the manly men, his attributes. I've collected the many attributes of the Western hero and kind of sorted them into 3 overarching groupings, just because everyone loves a numbered list. So 1, the frontier myth, 2, permissible violence, and 3, the Lone Ranger. It's already ironic here, I think, that I'm referring to him as the Western hero and not as, say, the cowboy, as many people might assume him to be. Because if you look at these movies, in most cases, these men aren't cowboys. In most cases, they have other jobs or no set job at all. And so the notion of this as the like cowboys and Indians genre of cinema is kind of a mini myth in itself. The very idea of the cowboy hero is kind of a symbolic one rather than one based on the reality of the genre. And this mismatch of myth, history, reality, and fiction and memory is what makes these Hollywood ideals of masculinity so powerful and potentially so dangerous. It is all part of the contradictory nature of the Western hero, where he represents the establishment but owns nothing, is a hard worker but unemployed, represents good but uses gratuitous violence, is attracted to women but refuses to settle down. The male hero represents a type of hypermasculinity that is based on heterosexuality, physicality, violence, and individualism. Okay, so there's this idea called the frontier thesis, and it's kind of like a myth inside of a myth, like a sort of mythception situation. It was coined by American historian Frederick Jackson Turner in the 1890s, essentially arguing that the expansion of the Western frontier was instrumental in the creation of American attitudes, institutions, and progress. An overview that makes sense until you get into the specifics of how this impetus behind this expansion was some kind of uniquely masculine American drive to retake the universe, which transformed European settlers into uniquely rugged democratic Americans, a myth historians have long critiqued, especially for erasing indigenous peoples and overlooking violence. The idea of this process being the making of these men, while also being the making of the American nation, is also, of course, linked to the historical concept of manifest destiny. That is the idea that white Christians in America had not just a duty or a right, but a literal God-given destiny to expand westward, to conquer the land and claim it as their own. There were great numbers of people who needed new land, and the Indians were selfishly trying to keep it for themselves. It's a sense of inevitable entitlement, right? That this is not just how history turned out, but how it was always meant to be, that continues to support the idea of both masculine and American superiority. Early films, like Cecil B. DeMille's The Squaw Man of 1914, embody this transformation narrative. An English aristocrat becomes a more authentic, tougher version of himself in the West. Later films, such as John Ford's Stagecoach of 1939, cemented the Western hero's journey, danger, moral testing, and personal reinvention as a central American storyline. So we can see evidence of this frontier hero archetype in a number of classic plots, scenes, and behaviours across the Western genre. The Naked Spur, for example, utilises the harsh conditions of the frontier land itself to challenge its characters throughout the film. They encounter rock slides, raging rivers, and stormy weather. During the climax of the movie, our Western hero, Howard Kemp, utilizes a spur, that iconic emblem of the rugged cowboy, to overcome the dangers of this wild landscape by using it to help him scale a cliff face. And then he uses the same spur to attack the villainous Vandergrout, demonstrating his natural superiority over both place and person. In direct contrast, Vandergrout and the similarly awful Anderson are killed by a combination of nature's forces and another archetypal Western prop, the lasso, as they drown in the river. And so the ideal of the Western man is one who is able to conquer the land, but also other men who do not live up to the ideal. In the classic film High Noon, there is another example. A town marshal bravely remains in town as other men flee to face off against a murderous gang of a criminal that he sent to prison years ago. During the run of the film, we see Marshal Kane as this kind of singular hero, left alone to face his overwhelming foe as the rest of the town attempt to avoid the conflict, give in to the gang, cower in their homes, or abandon the town to save themselves altogether. He doesn't let his fiance's feminine pacifism get in the way of his courageous duty. She insists that she's going to leave on the noon train with or without him, but he stays to face the gang. He then displays his toughened and daring skills through horseback riding, unarmed combat, and a dramatic shootout where he stands alone against a gang of men. Through the lens of High Noon, we get a sense of white American masculinity as an ideal that not all men rise to. Kane is made to decide between different masculine attributes. When he's given the ultimatum by his would-be wife on their wedding day, he's being made to choose between the masculine ideal of husband and the masculine ideal of honor through confrontation and heroism. His choice to side with the second option is then rewarded and affirmed when his fiancée returns to the town to aid him, although more ineffectual in her help than a male sidekick might have been, as she finds herself captured as a human shield and then torn by her previous pacifism. In many ways, Westerns seem to view competence itself as masculine. As one critic points out, physical prowess and dexterity become the keys to a Western actor's success, and dramatic talent becomes less important than an ability to ride a horse, fight, and endure physical punishment. Competence in particular skills is certainly important, particularly the skill of enacting justified violence. Number 2 on our list. Okay, so in terms of the historical context here, we can look at something that historian Mike Wise described as the defensive conquest narrative of the Western genre, the framing of white American violence as justified, necessary, or inevitable. In this way, the continued westward expansion of settler colonialism that involved invading and settling onto existing tribal lands is framed as a righteous defensive struggle. Take, for example, the portrayal of the Comanche in The Searchers, where they're seen as nothing but ruthless barbarians who cannot be met man to man because there are no reasonable ideals that they will accept. They attack, kidnap, and kill, like, you could argue, many Western heroes do. But the difference is that they do so without acceptable justification. And so we can see how these Westerns are an embodiment of an American ideology of redemptive and purgative violence because it cleanses society of the other in eliminating the outlaw or savage. The violence of traditional Westerns is ultimately connected to either masculine stoicness or righteous passion. When he's stoic, the Western hero is almost anti-emotion, preferring an internal control over feminine hysterics and panic. He's a man of few words, but much action. And so, conversational understanding is unnecessary to assert his power. He was, therefore, a perfect hero for the silent movie era. Indeed, the iconic original film cowboy Bronco Billy has been described as studied quietness, slow and deliberate movements, intense gaze, and stone-faced expressions. However, there are selected moments where this ideal of masculinity is permitted emotionality, and that is almost always expressed through violence. Revenge plots are justified through historical lawlessness of the setting, creating the necessity for personal codes of justice. But we're reassured that morality is safe in the hands of the otherwise stoic white man. He can be overwhelmed by grief or pain or sadness, but the solution is almost always enacting violence on the men who committed those original crimes. This can then, of course, be contrasted with the native villain characters. The warrior villain in The Searchers, for example, is known as Scar, and in discussions around the film at the time of its making, we can start to see ways that the historical suspicions around the native populations was symbolically resonant in the mid-20th century when these films were at their peak of popularity. Wayne himself often spoke of Scar as a symbol of the red man, and thus in his twisted right-wing ideology of the communist New Reds, who represented for him precisely the same threats to civilization as the Native Americans portrayed in his film. Scar, in The Searchers, is notably portrayed in full masculine bravado, with many wives and with scalps of white women hanging proudly in his teepee. Violence within westerns is varied, but no western is complete without the presence of guns. Oh, bit of behind the scenes here. This little sheriff's badge came in a pack with a toy gun. Very obviously a toy, but I was still very paranoid that YouTube wouldn't like that and would demonetize the video if I had it as part of the outfit that I have on. But I did want to include it, so it is sneakily in the background somewhere. You might be able to see it. There's so much stuff in the background here that's truly, I found some great stuff in the library. If you'd like a full tour of the background set and like a behind the scenes thing, and also would like to support the channel at the same time, I'm going to put up a video tour situation on Patreon. It might actually be up already, so if you want to have a look at that, the link will be in the description. Anyway, back to the Western guns. The continued importance of firearms to the American identity, even today, means that it's no surprise that they are such a central part of an enduring myth of ideal American masculinity, right? Not only are they incidentally present in these movies, but shootouts and gunfights are most often like central to the climax of these narratives, and are seen therefore as a key part of the solutions of the problems of the wild and uncivilized West. It is so ubiquitous as to be like a natural extension of the masculine hero himself. Guns are power and violence and control, and power and violence and control are therefore intrinsically tied to this mythologized masculinity. Although the villains might also take up arms, a pistol don't make a man. It is the gent behind the gun that counts. Except the issue of who exactly is given permission to be a gent rather than a villain when both are wielding the same weapons that are meant to deal death is often overlooked by those invested in a black and white reading of the heroic Western role model. Okay, so our third and final bundle of attributes is the concept of the Lone Ranger. The ideal Western man as the isolated hero, and this isolation allows an audience to infer a number of things about his character. He is special, socially set apart, and self-reliant. And each of these elements of his lonesomeness in turn enhance facets of his masculinity. Indeed, scholar Brookman described the Western hero as an individual emancipated from history, happily bereft of ancestry, untouched and underfilled by the usual inheritance of family and race, an individual standing alone, self-reliant and self-propelling, ready to confront whatever awaited him with the aid of his own unique and inherent resources. The drifter figure of the Western is, of course, quiet and stoic, not looking for trouble, sometimes employed in desperate circumstances to temporarily enforce the law. His superior morals pull him into the narrative of the settlement's population, but he inevitably leaves afterwards. He might even grab a dame by the waist and plant a kiss on her, but he doesn't learn domesticity during the film's run. He isn't tamed or changed by his experience as the hero. He isn't looking for glory, but he might find it anyway, even if just in the cinema audience's eyes. Because to be alone as a man in these iconic Westerns is to be free, and what is more important to American masculinity as freedom. The Western celebration of rugged individualism feels quintessentially American in the way it connects to the self-made man ideals of the nation that flowed from the time of the country's founding all the way to the capitalist state of today. A man who can carve his own path and control his own fate is superior in this mindset to the man who relies on others and might relinquish his power for the greater good of the community. The figure of the lone male protagonist walking towards the sunset into the wild wildness outside a populated town after having done his heroic works for the people there. To me, it's about the limits of civilization and the understanding of the time that the film was made of the limits of America. It's this perpetual balancing act of having to acknowledge like the issues within the country of the time while still framing American white men as pioneers, always naturally pushing towards a progress that is just another day's ride away. The town is in America, those men are America. In this way, America might be a place that needs to be made great again, but the American men who have always occupied this supposed declining America can remain the saviors all along. Because, as I suggested at the start of this section, when we talk about Westerns, we're not really discussing the reality of life in the Wild West, but a scripted myth. The John Wayne heroes provided role models for modern masculinity are not necessarily reflective of genuine American history. And so now, it's time on our journey to consider the truth of the Western hero. Okay, so these movies are interpretations of the past, right? Rather than accurate replications. Even though those that valorize the characters in these movies speak about them as if they show us windows to the genuine past of American men. So what was the West of the past really like? Well, to begin with, the period that we're looking at was an extremely short one. In fact, the life of the cowboy on the range figure in reality only lasted 25 years, from 1870 to 1895, when barbed wire, the opening of the train service, and economic downturns ended the golden days of trail driving. And the crucial period of settlement in which most Westerns take place lasted only about 30 years, from 1860 to 1890. By 1890, all the American Indians had been either exterminated or placed on reservations. In 1889, the last unoccupied region in the West, the Oklahoma Territory, was open to homesteaders with a massive land rush. Even if we include the period of the California Gold Rush and the first wagon trains to Oregon, the entire period of Western settlement lasted less than 50 years. But hey, short periods of history can, of course, have huge importance. So what are some of the differences between this brief reality and the wealth of American portrayals of the era? Let's start very small, almost pedantically small, with just some of the imagery of the West. The classic objects and props and items that are synonymous with the era that we'd immediately say were obviously part of this vitally important part of American history. I don't know, like tumbleweeds, for example. Embarrassingly, the fact that this is fictionalized as part of the American West is pointed out by British children's history website Bite Size. Like, it's obviously talked about elsewhere, but I found it on a Bite Size website and I'm gonna read the Bite Size, what Bite Size has to say about it, okay? Obviously this information is elsewhere on the internet, but I just thought it was very funny to read the bite-sized quote. It's not native to the US. The first tumbleweed only arrived in South Dakota around 1873, most likely in a shipment of flaxseed from Russia, and reached the far west towards the end of the century. Given that the period referred to as the Old West was around 1865 to 1895, tumbleweed probably wouldn't have been as common a sight as the movies would have us believe. Well, it's a good thing that I didn't spring for the tumbleweed props in the background of this video. What about what I did buy for this godforsaken setup? This amazing hat, for example. Obviously isn't a real cowboy hat, but this is a pretty good approximation of what the manly men of the day would have worn, right? Oh wait, BBC Bite Size, what are you doing back here again? The 10-gallon, with its wide curved brim and crease in the top crown, is the Stetson. While it was eventually popular after it was first introduced in 1865, the early versions looked very different to the later Stetsons that we see in movies. They had flat brims and no crease in the crown. It was also far from the most popular. People in the West wore an amazing array of different hats, including sombreros, flat caps, military caps, beaver pelt hats, and even top hats. But the most popular and versatile hat was the bowler hat, or derby. It was so widely worn that one journalist writing in the 1950s famously called it the hat that won the West. But if I'd worn a bowler hat through this bit of the video, you'd assume I was an idiot who knew nothing about American history. It's a real Tiffany problem. Okay, one last object before we move on to some proper, real historical truths. I mean, they can't take our guns away, can they? BBC Bite Size! No, don't take the guns away! Contrary to the impression you might get from iconic Western standoffs, wandering around with a gun displayed on your belt was not only frowned upon, but was often against the law. Many towns had strictly enforced rules about carrying firearms within city limits, and visitors often had to check their guns into the local sheriff's office or at the hotel as soon as they arrived. So walking into a bar or saloon sporting a revolver was a strict no-no. In fact, even the word gunslinger is a Hollywood invention. It was first used in the 1920 Western Drag Harlan. Okay, so I did a bunch of reading on guns in the West and patterns of violence and things like that, and it turns out it's actually a very contested topic. So some historians say things like this quote, not from BBC Bite Size, I promise there's no more Bite Size for the rest of this video. By the 1870s, there was at the personal level an identification of masculinity with guns. Indeed, a gun seemed to most men a requisite for their very identity, and, at the public level, an increase in the rates of gun-related violence. Certainly, this is supported by Claire V. McKenna's research into murder rates in 3 frontier towns in Nebraska, Colorado, and Arizona between 1880 and 1920, all of which experienced high levels of lethal violence during this period. But at the same time, other historians point out that although the West, might not have been a utopian, peaceful land, that the notion of the West as uniquely violent, or that violence and a gun culture particularly shaped American character, is fallacious. Okay, so what was the reality then? Well, whether or not violence was commonplace in the towns or amongst the white communities that made up these settlements that were made possible through manifest destiny and westward expansion, this history was still steeped in colonial and settler violence. The US government's policy of homesteading encouraged Americans to move to colonized land, far from the idealized Western image of the principled masculine hero using violence in moral ways against criminal villains and violent savages. The reality was a wider sense of state violence from which many American citizens profited. Okay, so what about the figure of the Western hero himself? The ranch hand cowboy, riding bulls, lassoing cattle, and roaming the land. The quintessential image of white American masculinity. Well, one of the most ironic lies that Hollywood gets away with when it comes to historical Westerns is the lie that the cowboy figure of the West was necessarily a white man at all. Sources seem to sort of disagree on the exact figures, which is, I guess, understandable. There weren't necessarily a lot of cowboy-specific academic demographic studies at the time, but the amount of cowboys who weren't white, cowboys who were black and from indigenous populations in the area of North and Central America was seemingly significant. Indeed, the idea of the American cowboy itself actually stems from the Mexican vaquero, when cattle were introduced to the area and a combination of Iberian and native populations developed cattle driving techniques for that land. And famous black cowboys throughout the job's history include people like Nat Love and Bose Ickard, both born into enslavement. And the legacy of slavery on Texan cowboys was written about for the Smithsonian website recently. By 1825, slaves accounted for nearly 25% of the Texas settler population. By 1860, 15 years after it became part of the Union, that number had risen to over 30%. That year's census reported 182,566 slaves living in Texas. As an increasingly significant new slave state, Texas joined the Confederacy in 1861. Though the Civil War hardly reached Texas soil, many white Texans took up arms to fight alongside their brethren in the East. While Texas ranchers fought in the war, they depended on their slaves to maintain their land and cattle herds. In doing so, the slaves developed the skills of cattle tending, breaking horses, pulling calves out of mud, and releasing longhorns caught in the brush, to name a few, that would render them invaluable to the Texas cattle industry in the post-war era. The piece continues, revealing an alternate look at two aspects that we've seen treated as truth about the Western male hero, both that he was white, but also that he was by his nature an independent loner. African-American cowboys faced discrimination in the towns they passed through. They were barred from eating at certain restaurants or staying in certain hotels, for example, but within their crews they found respect and a level of equality unknown to other African-Americans of the era. Love recalled the camaraderie of cowboys with admiration. A braver, truer set of men had never lived than these wild sons of the plains, whose home was in the saddle and their couch, Mother Earth, with the sky for a covering. He wrote, they were always ready to share their blanket and their last ration with a less fortunate fellow companion, and always assisted each other in the many trying situations that were continually coming up in a cowboy's life. These writings by Love celebrate the Western man not as a solitary figure of masculine ideal, but as part of groups of men that supported and shared with each other. Alongside the cowboy figure, the masked figure known as the Lone Ranger is also speculated to have been based, at least part, on another black man of the era, Bass Reeves. And the expansiveness of masculinity in the West is not just a matter of race. The reactions to the release of Brokeback Mountain reveal a lot about the strength with which people cling to a narrow ideal of American masculinity in the world of the Western. The expansion of American masculinity to include the other is seen by those who celebrate this narrow narrow view of the identity as the same as destroying it. Again and again, we've seen the rejection and denial of access into the club, regardless of whether or not these outsiders are already historically shown of being capable of being inside it. We can see this clearly in the pushback to a museum exhibit entitled Out West, curated by historian Gregory Hinton in 2009. He said the Autry was getting into potentially risky territory with the program. They have conservative trustees they have to deal with. It has not been done without a lot of thought. One aspect of Out West that the Autry handled with special care was the title. An early suggestion was Gay in the West, but the team at the museum rejected it partly because it was too hard-hitting, according to Hinton. Officials of the museum said they disliked that title because it didn't include bisexuals and transgender people. Another title, Equality in the West, was rejected because it sounded too political. One of the aspects of this era of history that I found the most interesting while researching for the video is the way that those who celebrate it as a pinnacle of white American masculinity hold up with such unerring certainty, especially in light of the supposed crisis of masculinity that we are in now. And yet, what is often written about the masculinities of the time is that it was going through its own crisis. Many people seem to view the historical era that these westerns are set in as a simpler time, when men were men and understood their natural role as such. This current crisis of masculinity is a modern phenomenon born out of modern circumstances. But the real history of the period after the Civil War reveals even that to be a myth. Many men seemed desperate to artificially create opportunities to reenact the masculinities that they had lost through increasing modernity, especially as the masculinity of the Northern Territories' industrialism ended victorious and took on the task of creating homogeny of white American masculinity to continue into the future of the entire nation. Passively, white men demarked the time between work and leisure pursuits and used leisure as a means to recover seemingly lost masculine virtues. For example, this period saw an enormous rise in physical culture, which emphasized the importance of exercise and physical strength as a means to develop men's character and virtues. This was supplemented by men's participation in fraternal lodges and elite sports groups that allowed for homosocial bonding, and, through the exclusion of women and racial minorities, allowed for the solidification of gender dichotomies and intermasculine hierarchies that privileged white masculinity at the same time that differences and competition between white men became more apparent. Ultimately, the truth of the era of the West seems unimportant in the face of the legend of the Western genre. It's really these Hollywood portrayals that traditional men are now rallying for modern men to return to when they talk about cowboys in the Wild West, even if they seemingly don't realize it. Part of what's appealing to them is the idea that these are the men who forged westward in the creation of the America that they know now. And so acknowledging the nuances of these men and the westward expansion in reality is at odds with the message that by embodying the Western hero, they too can be vital to the future history of America. Ironically, this process of mythologizing was actually commented on in one of the most famous Western movie quotes that remains to this day from the man who shot Liberty Valance.
When the legend becomes fact, print the legend.
Because facts don't care about feelings, but apparently legends don't care about facts. The subversion of the Western hero. The development of the Western genre itself over the decades actually reveals a series of unstable ideas about true masculinity. But much like how the Western genre isn't reflective of the realities of the West, in history, the American perception of the Western genre isn't reflective of the reality of the movies. Instead, they cling to what is ultimately a vague approximation of whatever version of a Western genre hero suits their ideal of masculinity. So when it comes to historical films, there are three eras at play. Firstly, it's the era that the film is portraying. So in the case of Westerns, this is the mid to late 1800s. The second one is the era that the film has been made. So for Westerns, this could be any time from the early 1900s to today, with the heyday in kind of the mid 20th century. And thirdly, the era of the audience watching. For us, obviously, that's today. The difference and connections between the first two in film studies has been described as hyperlinear history by scholar Emma Hamilton in her study of the Western genre. The connection between the era that the film is portraying and the era the film is made, especially when it comes to thematic preoccupations between those two eras. Each era of Westerns, when compared to the time that they were made, reveals anxieties and preoccupations about masculinity at the time. The so-called golden era of Westerns in the 1950s, for example, often prioritized narratives of order versus chaos or civilization versus the wilderness, which makes sense when we consider that this is the post-war era where stability might naturally be valued over moral complexity, the questioning of authority. Some of these heroes struggle with integrating into a society that was distinct from the harsher life that they lived in the wilds of the West. And in the same way, many men coming back home from one, maybe even two world wars might be similarly struggling with this transition. Historians have said that this post-war era in America reflected an all-encompassing re-evaluation of American society, where many Americans came to regard groups of fellow countrymen as enemies with whom they were engaged in a struggle for the nation's very soul. In a way, that's thematically connected to a post-Civil War era of masculinity that was also struggling with the reconstruction questions of civilization and society. But the Westerns of the 50s saw this struggle as meaningful but surmountable, whereas by the time the end of the 1960s rolls around, we enter the era of the revisionist Western. Westerns often connected to the disenfranchisement of men seemingly unable to adapt and integrate into an industrializing society due to their lack of necessary skills and personal alienation from their labor, with a sense of a wholesale challenge to their sense of self that fundamentally undermines traditional patriarchal values. And these again make sense in the historical context of an America full of men disillusioned by the Vietnam War. Wild Bunch is a notoriously violent Western of this era, which typifies this pessimistic view of the West, but also contemporary America for the original audiences. And so we can see even the era most associated with classic Westerns and their ideal masculine leads aren't a straightforward vision of American masculinity. From ethically dubious anti-heroes to foreign imaginings of America in Italian spaghetti Westerns, as we move into the 60s and 70s, we see another transformation of the genre. These were, of course, influenced by Hollywood's pursuit of profit too, as potential makers of Westerns saw the popularity of things like exploitation cinema and combined the two in films that were marketed as movies that would show realistic and hitherto unseen depictions of the West. These late 1960s American exploitation Westerns featured a heady mix of violent Western action and softcore sexual situations. But I think it should be acknowledged that almost all of these tales are not necessarily a rejection of the white male protagonist, but rather the mechanisms around him. And it's always around him, right? He engages with the broken systems and political distrust that affect white men through history, not ones that might affect other demographics. To get to movies that start to break down the centering of white American masculinity itself, you kind of need to look at more modern portrayals for the most part. Westerns with black protagonists ultimately have a choice. Knowing the racial disparity at the time of traditional Westerns being set, to set themselves within the original era and tackle this disparity, to give themselves the aesthetics of the era but create a kind of race-blind ahistorical world, or to set the movie in a more modern era. Examples like The Harder They Fall in 2021 cast an ensemble of black leads with characters taken from real historical figures of the era. This film ultimately sort of went the secondary route. There's been interviews with the creatives behind the film where they talk about the idea of not wanting to make this a black Western, but the makeup of the ensemble cast, the fact that they are all black actors, is significant, and it is something that has been talked about by critics at length. Whereas there's also like modern horror film Nope, which arguably would be a kind of sci-fi Western. This again has both on-page and also metaphorical connections to, although not set during the Wild West era, there's very clearly a centralization of the black experience within that movie, both on the page and also kind of metaphorically implied within these speculative elements. And then there is, of course, the queer Western, most notably Brokeback Mountain, which breaks the tradition of white American masculinity within the genre in a different way. Within Brokeback Mountain, no matter how well the leads fit into the archetype of the Western hero, being capable and gruff and stoic, their queerness means that they can never be part of the right kind of masculinity. And in light of that, isolation in Brokeback Mountain reveals itself to not be a natural part of manhood, but actually a profound loneliness. The happiness is found not through this rugged masculine isolation and refusal of emotions, but rather in the connection with each other and the land. The impossibility of the lasting connection, an impossibility created and sustained by real masculinity, is ultimately what leads to the tragedy of the ending. A mockery of the Western genre embodied in every movie cowboy. I can't think of a more effective way to alienate most movie-going Americans than to show two cowboys lusting after each other and even smooching. Ironically, even though that critic apparently was negative about the movie, they obviously haven't seen the movie because they do, my God, so much more than smooch. Okay, so here's a secret about this script. I struggled with the order of how I wanted to discuss this all with you, because you'll notice in this section that we just had about Westerns, I also had to talk about the 1950s and about war, but I I couldn't go on huge tangents and start talking about those two sections too early because I needed to stay on track and get through the cowboys first. But what I just said about both of those other topics is about to come back around. So let's retrace our steps here. Let's rewind and just jump back to the classic era when these westerns were being made. We focus in on an America of quaint, idyllic suburbs, smiling diner waitresses dropping off a malt shake for a pair of high school sweethearts to share. A family man in a sharp suit opens the front door with a cheerful cry of "Honey, I'm home," as his wife greets him with her apron neatly tied and dinner already on the table. It's time to talk about the ideal of the 50s man. Okay, so I just tried to find I was like, I'm sure I have a book that could, something like a proper something to do with the 1950s that I could have here. I looked over and I found I have this book about toys and children's culture in the age of TV marketing, which is so sick. It's like a cowboys stuff. Unhelpful, we've moved on from cowboys. But the only book I can find just in my pile right now about the 1950s is this extremely old and battered copy of a really rare and iconic lesbian text called Boots of Leather, Slippers of Gold, a history of a lesbian community. So just pretend that this 50s housewife that I'm dressed at is a closeted lesbian, I guess. That's the lore behind the character. Okay, so portrayals of the 1950s in Hollywood and wider media are all about nostalgia. They ultimately rely on a yearning for a vision of the past that, again, didn't really exist in the first place, right? There have been a number of explosions of 50s nostalgia. The first one, ironically enough, happening during the 50s themselves. Emerging from post-war television, the Leave It to Beaver-esque white patriarchal middle-class family gathered around the dinner table in their suburban bungalow. They emerge from advertising, a stylish young couple swooning over the latest tail-finned car. Sometimes this car is parked at a diner in a nod to an emerging youth culture. Sometimes it's parked against the backdrop of a rocket launch site, suggesting that its technological supremacy and futurity are inherited from America's advances in the space race. But since then, we've seen the imagery in classics like Back to the Future and Grease and Crybaby, as well as real diners, bowling alleys, cinemas that utilize the idyllic and optimistic view of the era to create welcoming and culturally familiar spaces even outside of America. So, to try and get this all straight, let's try the same method we did with westerns, starting with breaking down the attributes that the 50s man seems to bring to white American masculinity. Here's attributes. So I've combined these again into 3 groupings. What's interesting is that these groupings are different to that of the Western hero, but they don't necessarily undermine him either. Indeed, we'll see how figures as different as the Lone Ranger and the corporate breadwinner can ultimately be molded into the same masculine expectations. So for this section, our handy numbered list is 1. Self-control and power, 2. Financial success, and 3. Opposition to femininity. So let's start with self-control and power. The first thing you notice about the 1950s nostalgic man is how far his power comes from his specific brand of self-control. He is refined and emotionally placid, perhaps not as stoic as the Western hero though. Back to the Future is a really interesting example of this kind of 50s nostalgia intersecting with masculinity, because the plot is ultimately about our central hero, Marty McFly, going back in time to fix his dad into being the right kind of man so that he can attract Marty's mum and conceive Marty in the first place. Specifically, he does this by encouraging him to more closely align with the Reagan-era ideal of muscular masculinity at the center of the nuclear family. Yeah, young Martin's hero's journey is a lot about repairing his own nuclear family, and the barrier to this is mainly his dad being what the kids these days call a beta cuck, lacking in masculine virtues. And Marty also goes through a transformation himself, forged in the fires of 50s nostalgia to emerge as the kind of guy who no longer is scared of bullies or rejection. His father, George, must instead become the ideal man by standing up for himself and protecting the woman he loves, as Lorraine says. George does so, overcoming his fear and knocking out Biff with one punch. The impact on George's social standing is immediate. George is suddenly transformed into the big man on campus, garnering the praise of his peers and encouragement to run for class president. This remolding of his father into the kind of man who exerts his masculine power has a ripple effect into the modern era of the 80s, where he is now a successful author and family man, newly attractive to his, are we surprised, thinner wife, even resulting in Marty's siblings becoming more successful, demonstrating the importance of the 50s American man's role as the husband and parent in securing the progress of America across future generations. Even in an era where the household was the woman's domain and child-rearing a wife's responsibility, somehow the success of the entire family is ultimately at the hands of the patriarch. Which brings us on to number 2, financial success. So in this era, financial success is like literally part of masculine identity. We actually see this in George McFly's new mastery over his masculinity, with his improved 1980s self playing tennis in this kind of upper class pastime, or his old work supervisor, Biff, instead looks after his car. Financial success in this nostalgic era is about buying freedom, earning access to leisure time, a spacious family home, and maybe even the kind of job that lets you have a few rounds of golf with the guys on a weekday afternoon. Just men being men on the golf course. It isn't a coincidence that we see a surge of 50s nostalgia during the 80s. Politically, this comparison was at the forefront of Ronald Reagan's New Right. To understand the history of Reagan's strategic mobilization of the 50s, we must recognize the crucial rhetorical turn in his early political career, after which he no longer defined himself solely in terms of rejection of communism, of the New Deal, of civil rights, of the 60s, and instead began defining himself mostly in terms of return to prosperity, to traditional values, to global security, to the 50s. This political narrative of a return is something that we become all too familiar with in the age of Trump's MAGA rhetoric. The idea that there was some time in the vague American past a stalling of progress, and so there is a time when all the best elements of the nation are waiting for us still. For many, that remains the 1950s, or at least the Hollywood nostalgia of it. The 1950s man is the sole breadwinner in a world where his one salary can pay for a house and a car or two, for his children to have new clothes and fresh dinners cooked by his housewife. He's a family man, respectable and hardworking, with a pen in his pocket and gel in his hair. This might at first seem counter to the ideal of, the free and independent Western masculinity, but I would argue that the underlying ideal is still there. It's just that this 20th century man is able to manifest freedom and independence through financial power. And so we come to the third set of attributes, which is opposition to femininity. Because I think the final ingredient to this 1950s man is kind of measured more in what he is not. In every way, he must strive to embody everything that is in opposition to that which is feminine. This is connected to the idea of clear and comforting gender roles in the era, a kind of clarity and reassurance that reiterates a stable idea of masculinity that many men might feel is missing now in the world of diverse opinions on the role of gender, whether it kind of has a role at all. In one study into the 50s nostalgia of modern subcultures, where people dress in the 50s era style, it revealed how many of these men connect with these clear gender roles still. This element of their style isn't just about the aesthetics. He also has little time for today's style lines, particularly those of teenagers, saying, "Not with the clothing they put on, not my style. Boys want to look like girls." He believes the 1950s clothing style was quite gender divided, where boys were boys and girls were girls. But today, sometimes you have to look twice and go, okay, you have to look twice. You can't just look once. If there's one thing I say about today's youth, you gotta look twice. There is, of course, a secondary image of 50s masculinity, which is the rock and roll bad boy. Specifically, this is a boy, or most likely a young man, like Danny in Grease, who embodies the comparative tame rebellion of the time. The image of a smirking Elvis alongside screaming girls in his audiences only serves to demonstrate the gender divide further. Female fans are hysterical, whereas male stars are powerful. Danny's cheeky boy leathers in Grease are set amongst the haze of suburbia and Americana, with bright and cheerful aesthetics suggesting a perpetual happiness bursting from every street corner. He's not a figure of any political protest or counterculture. It's a largely visual idea that Sandy can fit into by the end of the movie simply by changing her clothes to fit the style. By positioning the greaser in the 50s nostalgia as simply another 50s man in a different getup, these Hollywood retellings effectively erase the anti-conformity political spirit from the real historical subculture. Okay, so with that, I guess it's time we looked at what the era was really like. The truth about 50s nostalgia. Okay, so what was going on in the 50s for real though? Well, if we take a second to remove the pink lady's tinted glasses, we can see that there's a lot more hiding behind the poodle skirts and slick back hair. Our presentation of the 50s on film is ironically a nostalgia similar to that of the 50s westerns about the American West in the 1800s, one which, as we've seen, isn't necessarily connected to the reality of the era. And so, as we did with westerns, let's now look at what's lurking behind the white American masculine ideal of the 50s man. So first, let's talk about the financial realities of the era. Part of the draw of the 1950s politically is the vision of it as the golden era of capitalism. when the country was experiencing a post-war boom. Sales of consumer products went through the roof, including large purchases like cars, which contributed to the expansion of suburbs and the shopping-specific development of things like malls. This wasn't, of course, a straight decade of nothing but boons. There were recessions at the start and end of the 50s, for example, and the standard of living was different than it was today, with smaller houses on average and a big chunk of the population not having complete plumbing in their houses. Indeed, the middle-class aesthetic of the 50s nostalgia didn't tell close to the whole story, with millions of Americans living in poverty. By 1960, 8 million Americans earned less than $1,000 a year, according to a Senate report at the time. Nationwide welfare campaigns, which might have alleviated the effects of poverty, such as food stamps, also didn't exist at the time. Similarly, looking at the ideal of financial independence, the truth might be less sunny. White men's financial dominion in the 1950s was seen as a sign of their natural place in the social order, but it was a race that only they were able to run unencumbered. The income and wealth disparity between white men and other demographics was often stark, and the impact of that disparity on generational wealth and opportunities continued after the 50s were over. In 1970, as in 1950, black males in Boston earned less than 3/4 of what whites earned. In 1950, the median income for black males was only 7/10 of the white median. This fell to 6/10 by 1960, which, unsurprisingly, I imagine for many of you, leads us right into our second truth behind the 50s nostalgic myth, the civil rights movement. Ever heard of a little thing called, oh my god, the 50s was so unbelievably I can't believe that we continue to think that this was a nostalgic era, huh? Anyway, the whiteness of these pastel images of middle-class American suburbia were not an accident. The 1950s was an era of violent racism, legal inequality, and civil rights struggles. This aspect of the era is not an inconvenient add-on or an unfortunately separate issue, but an essential part of the perfect white American 1950s man, because his financial and social success was contingent on segregation. After all, this is the era of legalized voter suppression through tactics like poll taxes, widespread and vicious opposition to racial integration, riots in the streets over even a single black family moving into all-white neighborhoods, and horrifically violent hate crimes, including the murder of Emmett Till. The financial policies which have supported the success of white American men failed to materialize in the same way for their black counterparts, limiting access to post-war military benefits, for example. The GI Bill after World War II was supposed to give access to free education and home ownership loans, but the impact of segregation and racism led to many being denied mortgages or entrance into universities that weren't all black institutions because of their race. At this point, we might also want to consider the gender inequality of the 1950s. This was an era of widespread and legalized misogyny too, similar to many black servicemen who had fought for their country before returning to face discrimination within the very nation that they'd risked their lives for. American society promoted women's expanded roles as a form of patriotism, but as soon as the war ended, many Americans expected women to return to the home to fulfill their domestic duties to prepare themselves for the time when they became wives and mothers. Employers now push women from higher paying and secure wartime jobs to the service sector to make way for returning veterans. Thus, entering the workforce and becoming fathers and husbands now became the hallmarks of American masculinity after the war. And legally, women were far from equal too, unable to open their own credit accounts or access loans without a man co-signing. Their access to financial or social independence was limited. Marital rape was legal, divorce laws restrictive, and expectations on gender behavior was everywhere. And of course, for black women who occupied the intersecting experiences of both of these aspects of inequality, they were impacted by the unique combinations of both. In light of these historical realities, the idea of returning to this era being a kind of American heyday, it's honestly laughable. So the final bit of 1950s reality that runs counter to this nostalgic ideal is actually the same as the truth of the Western era, which was that there was a crisis of masculinity happening in the 50s too. When is masculinity not in crisis? That's what I've learned from the research in this video, I swear to God. The reality of a rise in conformist white-collar jobs, which were ostensibly opposed to the previous ideals of white American masculinity, meant that the messaging around the ideal had to shift, right? We can see the 1950s growth of consumer capitalism collide with the era's own nostalgic yearning for masculinity of yesteryear and the popularity of the Western, exemplified in the Marlboro Man, the advertising mascot for the cigarette brand introduced in the 50s. These ads position the product as distinctly masculine, with a range of Marlboro men, from sailors to businessmen, most often with a rugged tattoo on the back of their hand to signify the heights of their masculine toughness. But the most iconic Marlboro Man was, of course, a Western cowboy hero. The inclusion of other professions and pastimes insisting to men seeing the ad that they could embody that bygone masculinity too, if only they bought themselves access to the products of that lifestyle. Underneath the veneer of ideal suburban domesticity, however, lay an increased disquiet amongst social commentators regarding the masculinity being stimulated by such an environment. As Thomas Andrew Joyce observes, although a masculinity that derives its identity from white-collar labour was becoming the norm in the 1950s, there was a concern that such labour was in fact emasculating. And so it had to become possible to pursue a job that meant that you sacrificed your power and freedom to a financially superior corporate manager, never engaging with masculine physical labour, but still be able to be the right kind of man. And so markers of masculine success changed to meet those shifts in the workplace. When we look back at the nostalgic 50s, this is seen as a smooth transition, which displayed masculine achievement and success. But the reality of the 50s wasn't necessarily so smooth. Social commentators at the time, for example, questioned if the white-collar worker could be categorized as a self-made man at all, and whether the passivity of the work stunted his masculinity. The 50s conformity that formed critiques of the era today was already being critiqued at the time too, as social scientists came to see in this culture a challenge to the capacity of individuals to retain any psychological autonomy. The organization, they argued, was a debilitating force, creating alienated conformists afraid to challenge prevailing norms. They were people who would take no risks, people who feared to be different. Corporate workers, critics argued, face constant pressures to get along by going along. And so we can see how the image of the 50s masculinity that so many modern right-wing commenters insist will make America great again is just as fraught with doubts and social questions as we are today, or have been before. So, are there any portrayals of the 50s on film challenging these notions? Let's look at the subversion of 1950s nostalgia. When it comes to examining subversions of the 50s, these movies need to directly engage with 50s nostalgia, rather than being examples of historical pieces that happen to be set in the 50s. Movies like Carol or shows like The Queen's Gambit. Those highlight some of the problematic realities of the 50s, but in a way that doesn't acknowledge the mythology around the period. For the purposes of this video, we're looking at subversive movies which form critiques around the celebration of the 50s era, not those which make historical representation of the era itself. And so we need to look at the realm of genre cinema, dystopias, science fiction, historical fantasy, where current views of the 50s can be directly engaged with in a kind of meta way. Perhaps the most popular route to 1950s subversion is through commentary on the gender roles of the time. I think it says a lot about the way that many women instinctually cringe at the concept of the 50s in reality, that as soon as we got even a hint of Florence Pugh's costume in Don't Worry Darling, all of us unanimously were like, oh, that's going to be a nightmare horror movie. That's dystopia. That is going to be a bad time for her. The concept of enforced gender norms in dystopian fiction is present across, honestly, like almost the whole of the dystopian genre. But what makes the 50s particularly delicious for storytellers is the shiny veneer of perfection that the era nostalgia claims. We know women are suffering during this time, and yet we're still fed the glossy commercialized imagery of the pearly white smile of contented housewife doting on her man and taking her natural place as mother and homemaker. Whereas other sexist dystopias, like say The Handmaid's Tale, reveal more openly the horrors of misogyny baked into the world building. Handmaids systemically assaulted and bred to birth children for the upper classes. Movies like Don't Worry Darling or The Stepford Wives, however, establish the perfection of the setting, and that itself becomes part of the horror. We've seen recent representations of this suburban sexism outside of the strictly 50s setting in shows like Kevin Can Himself, where the reality of life as a sitcom wife is revealed by cutting between the studio comedy complete with laugh track and a naturalistic drama showing the fallout of the same events. There are also a number of 50s critiques that target the wider messaging of conformity and control seen in the nostalgic views of the era. Probably the most well-known is the film Pleasantville, where two teens find themselves trapped in a black and white TV show set in a seemingly perfect small American town in the 50s. The gradual breaking of the townspeople from their conformist and mundane lives is visualized on screen as the introduction of color to their reality. One of the most compelling aspects of this movie to me is its commitment by the filmmakers to truly celebrate the idea of freedom in these color reveals, where characters find contradictory experiences allow them to see color. One woman's color is triggered by sexual freedom, and then another's is discovered by new autistic passion, for example. Similar to the example of Kevin himself, where the contrast of ideal and reality is indebted to 50s nostalgia, even if it doesn't take place in the 50s. I think we can argue that The Truman Show is another example of this. The idyllic controlled world that Truman lives in at the start of the movie isn't literally the 50s, but the suburban sameness and eerie control that gradually becomes more and more apparent to the title character as he discovers his life is a TV reality show where he is the only one in the dark sure feels familiar. And then finally, we have works that engage with the persistent whiteness of this nostalgia. Ironically, a topic that many other critiques seem to leave out altogether. Pleasantville, Edward Scissorhands, and the first season of Mad Men, set in 1959, all acknowledge racism and segregation, but do so either metaphorically, without a single person of colour in the film, or by using black actors as receptors of racist abuse. That is, they exist to manifest the existence of racism, but little else. The agency, emotions, subjectivities, and desires of black characters remain undeveloped. There have been a few more recent examples of TV shows which explore the 50s nostalgia from the point of view of black protagonists. The first is Lovecraft Country, centered around a man searching for his father across segregated America, who encounters, as the title suggests, Lovecraftian horrors along the way. These horrors, of course, create a symbolic comparison to the all too real horrors of the American racism in the Jim Crow era. Unlike the movies which subvert the 50s experience of white womanhood, there is no initial veneer of safety for these characters, not even in the all-black neighborhoods, as the show includes a storyline about the Tulsa Race Massacre. This, of course, reflecting the lack of safety or escape for black citizens at the time. The first season of the TV show Them similarly contrasts the black family's experience of racism in the 50s as they move into an all-white neighborhood with their experience of the supernatural forces there. Unlike most other films that appeal to allegory, metaphor, or euphemistic intimation to engage the violent history of suburban integration, Them seeks to foreground in unflinching terms the violence that black pioneers did experience in the southern states they left, as well as the regions of the United States to which they moved. And finally, similarly to Kevin Can Fuck Himself and The Truman Show, there's a non-50s movie that still connects spiritually to the 50s nostalgia critiques in terms of race, and that I think is Get Out. The creepily relentless smiles of the black characters around Chris, despite their circumstances, and the overwhelming wealthy whiteness of the idyllic suburban setting has the same texture as those other examples of the rot that can exist beneath the surface of a supposed utopia. Okay, so we looked at the Western hero, and then we circle back around to the 50s, and now it's time to jump into the middle for a third and final historical figure of masculine virtues, and the reason why I bought this truly heinous poster to put in the background of this video. Let me show you this poster. It truly, just this one poster, is a distillation of everything you're about to see me talk about. My God. Oh, let's put him back. Let's put him back here. The ideal of the American soldier, the patriotic fighter, the brave troops, willing to put their life on the line to defend America. They combine physicality with the inner attributes of ideal masculinity, and they have the added bonus of being politically connected to the militarized foreign policy that many of those trying to make American men great again support wholeheartedly, through thick and thin, administration after administration, enemy after enemy. Hollywood has argued the case for the masculine American savior through war films. Now, oftentimes this idea of war comes with only a minimal nod to political complexity or muddy moral waters. In the world of many war movies, war is, it's difficult, but it's also kind of simple in that it's a patriotic act to serve and is therefore fundamentally a moral act. It is the closest the white American man can get to being part of America itself. Within explicitly pro-military movies, of which there are a number, war is evidence of the godliness and goodness of America itself. There is no America itself without the white men who serve it, defend it, and protect it, seemingly almost entirely by themselves. Depending on the war being depicted, white American men might be heroes fighting for the mythologized concept of the land of the free, or they might be the true victims of a conflict, but they are almost always at the center. Traditional representations of the American soldier circle around two main ideas, I think. One is that America is freedom, and two, that freedom is because of American soldiers, who are almost all 100% straight white men. We have them and them alone to thank for every stateside blessing. And this idea isn't just in strictly war films. Like, when Indiana Jones's actions end up melting Nazi faces, he isn't primarily helping the Nazis' victims, he is saving America. Like, Raiders of the Lost Ark ends in an American government building, and even though the moment in question is a critique of aspects of the American government, it is not a critique of the American soul. Indiana Jones, the hero, is the American soul. He saved America from evil. He protects American freedom. The act of saving is in many ways more important than the impact of that saving. So it's our third and final figurehead of white American masculinity, the soldier. Let's look at his attributes, shall we? You know how this goes. One more time. I've separated them into 3 categories because we love a numbered list. Those are 1, justified violence, 2, humanized focus, and 3, valorous bravery. For the last time, his attributes. So, number 1, justified violence. This is obvious. In order for a soldier to be a hero, you need for his acts of war to be justifiable. But this isn't always very difficult. In many cases, a film just assumes that you'll understand that the other side had to die. The Second World War is low-hanging fruit here because every soldier from across the Japanese side of the Pacific Theater is assumed by the narrative to be an individually evil Asian Nazi. Therefore, any film set during that period can include scenes of battle massacre with no extra justification needed. Genuinely, one of the most baffling examples of this in action is in the movie Hacksaw Ridge, which sort of presents itself as a story with a pacifist hero based on a real man. Okay, so leading man Desmond Doss is a Seventh-day Adventist, and so he refused to use a weapon of any kind on religious grounds, and we see these traumas of violence in his past. So he nearly accidentally killed his brother during childhood, and he grew up in a house with a PTSD-ridden father, still suffering from his experiences during the First World War. And during the movie, he essentially proves his worth to his brothers in arms by selflessly going out into the battlefield and carrying the wounded back to safety down a cliffside without even a weapon himself, piously praying to his God the whole time, that he be allowed to save just one more, I want to save one more. Very Hollywood, but okay, we maybe have a movie about a soldier and war where there isn't the glorification of, oh wait, no, sorry, because the finale scene of this film, it's not him pulling hundreds of soldiers out of no man's land into safety. That wasn't the finale. It's actually afterwards where the rest of the battalion wait until he's finished praying before they go out and massacre the enemy. It was like she was too stunned to speak, was truly me in the cinema when I watched that movie. I knew it was coming. There was a part of me that was like, maybe this time it will be different. Nope. Even in a film about a pacifist, there is a need to make masculine American heroics be this one thing, and the one thing is either killing or being killed for your country. Violence in the world of the war movie is a sign of competence, of patriotism and idealized masculinity, and has the added bonus of being a real good dramatic vehicle for a visually impressive grand finale on screen. To be truly masculine within this genre is to be capable of violence. To be truly American is to be a patriot. In a war movie, the American white man is single-handedly keeping America afloat through violence. In a circular logic, the violence is justified because of its connection to patriotism. There we go. War is also a medium for the white American man and his male compatriots to bond through violence, either through enacting it or surviving it. They are violent together towards a common enemy, and it connects them. It is the method and language through which men on screen can bond while still being allowed to be men. And one of the ways that violence is justified within these movies is the narrative positioning of the American soldier as the point of view hero. And so we get to our second attribute, a humanized focus. So the feeling that we get from many of these war movies is that the man on the other side of the battlefield is so un-American that he is functionally inhuman. If he is on the receiving end of an American gun, the film feels very little obligation to treat him as a human being. In fact, the more inhuman the enemy is, the more human our leading American white man becomes, and the less ability we have as an audience to question if our lead is doing the right thing. If our American white man is the only one acting humanely or humanly, all his actions are right and America is right. The post-9/11 genre of war movie is notorious for its treatment of Middle Eastern villains, generic Muslim bad guys. They don't have to be given specific crimes by the narrative, because the collective shorthand understanding by American audiences was, well, that's a terrorist. Innocent civilians, children, say that soldiers encountered in these countries in these narratives serve only to highlight what nice guys these American military men are to those that deserve it. And they very much reflect real interviews with men deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan who would talk about giving candy to local kids as a feel-good story while they were invading the country. The brown enemies in these movies are often nameless and voiceless, speaking only in untranslated dialogue, if at all. just emphasizing their difference, their foreignness, and ultimately their un-Americanness. So the focus of the American point of view is not surprising given these are American movies, right? But it is interesting to see how this focus leads to the very presence of American soldiers being seen by many as evidence of support for the military warfare and the characters within, even in movies that some might consider to be more on the side of war criticism. American Sniper is a classic example of this tension, with some people praising it for its anti-war stance, while simultaneously, notorious website Breitbart called it a patriotic pro-war on terror masterpiece. During an opening scene in that movie, the main character shoots and kills a child who was carrying a grenade launcher. And in many ways, it feels like the audience members' distinctive answer to whether or not that was a moral action informs how they feel about the ultimate message of the movie, whatever their answer was. And even those talking about the nuance of war movie that allows us to question the ethical choices of American soldiers, they often by default ignore the potential of those fighting against Americans to also have their own ethical choices. Instead, they're treated as mindless killers that the American hero must mold their complex moral quandaries around. Am I right? Am I wrong for doing this action? They're the only ones who are being treated complexly. And now we come to the third attribute on our list, valorous bravery. So another key feature of American soldiers in these narratives is a sense of loyalty, bravery, and brotherhood. The moral character of individual soldiers then, in many cases, allows these movies to avoid wider moral questions around the wartime settings in general. Saving Private Ryan, for example, is a quintessential story of military bravery, as a band of brothers sets out against the odds to bring home one of their own. Yet, critics argue, even if the film depicts the brutality of war, the narrative's messaging dismisses any possible impact that this might have. Though Private Ryan gives us a disturbingly graphic image of war, its straightforward message that the military stands for undiluted honor and nobility without a hint of ambivalence results in a film that undermines any critique we might otherwise read into it. It is said that to be brave, you must first be scared. This is often not so with the American soldier character, replacing fear often just with patriotism, because within this masculine ideal, patriotism is an emotion, I guess. Our proof that the American white man setting off to cinematic war is in touch with his emotions lies in the fact that he is going to war at all. That act is the externalization of a feeling, just the same as a marriage proposal or a punch. Patriotism is a virtue for fictional American women who understand why their husbands go off to fight for freedom or who finds themselves assisting surgeries in battle because it's the right thing to do, but patriotism is an actionable emotion for fictional American men. And so any show of emotion by these men can be excused as a demonstration of just how much he is suffering for his country. Men at home who cry are pussies, but soldiers who cry, by God, what they must be going through for us. The American white man in a war movie is open to his emotions. He's a patriot, of course. He loves his girl at home or over there in the medical tent or wherever she is. He misses his mum's casserole back in Indiana. He feels happy playing volleyball with his bros shirtless on the beach. But when our man gets shot in the leg, he gets up and he keeps firing because pain, it's also kind of an emotion in these movies. The leading American white man in a war movie, he could cry, he absolutely could, and he so would. He just doesn't have to. He is so in touch with his emotions, he just happens to not have any masculine ones. Ultimately, American masculinity is to be a savior. That, I think, is possibly Hollywood's favorite version of events. Some film genres depict a team of American masculinities saving through singular intelligence and good old-fashioned grit. Disaster movies and action movies love this combo. And then there are movies that celebrate the ingenuity, strength, capability, creative genius, and simply ineffable charisma of the white American man doing right by his country or by himself. Think about Ethan Hunt or Jack Ryan or Jack Reacher or Jackson Ryland. That last one was fake, but who knows? It might not be by the time this video comes out. And war movies are the most crystallized version of this American savior fetish, because these soldiers are, of course, saving America itself. And there is nothing braver than that. The reality of war. Okay, so the really fun thing about the distance between the reality of war and the Hollywood portrayals is that some of the glorification and positivity of the American military in movies is due to the American military collaborating on the creative and financial process of those movies, including requiring script approvals and providing funding in exchange for positive representations on screen. Those kind of things. Here's the thing. I don't have time to go into, in this video, all of the issues with the American military that those collaborations might be trying to, downplay or push under the rug. So for the purpose of this video, where we're talking about the specific figureheads of American masculinity, I am just going to focus on the reality of those figureheads and their experiences instead. So let's look at some elements of the military experience for American soldiers that are not so positive. Number one, soldiers are expendable. So let's just have a look first at the predatory recruitment processes of the US military. Lots of other YouTubers have covered these tactics at length, and I highly recommend you go and check out some of their videos if you're interested. But to recap, we got the more cringeworthy ideas like military influencers targeting propaganda on social media, video games used as tools of recruitment, but there's also the targeting of financially vulnerable populations to create a kind of poverty draft, as it's been called, for example. Overall, throughout history, the common soldier has been ultimately a tool for those more powerful to enact violence on their orders and die if the tacticians deem it necessary. One scholar whose book I read for research for this video talks about the experiences of his friends who served in Iwo Jima. He has only remarked that of the approximately 600 men who embarked with his unit, only 12 returned alive. At the time, he was only 18 years old. Both of my friends have asked me not to mention their names in this book, largely because one of the most profound and tragic experiences of the war for each of them was the total annihilation of individuality. Therefore, they wanted on record that as individuals, they were nothing special. War transforms men, as one of my friends has said, into nothing more than government issue. The term behind the familiar but seemingly cryptic abbreviation, GI. God, I got genuine, full body chills reading a lot of the sections in that book. And we can see the gap between the reality and the Hollywood fiction in examples like Saving Private Ryan, a film that embodied the inspirational idea of no man left behind. Yet in reality, the United States military has never expended such resources as the film depicts to live up to the no man left behind ideal. And I think it's good to note that the no man left behind is an ideal. It's not an official policy in the US military, because of course it isn't. What would that look like? How would it be implemented or enforced? I'd argue that it's a very effective rallying cry that is allowed to continue its association with the American forces, because saying, yeah, we try and get out our wounded and dead to safety, unless it would compromise the mission or be dangerous to others in the unit or would cost too much, it's not as pithy or inspirational, But it acts as both a powerful psychological comfort to those in those scenarios and a snappy but ultimately meaningless life motto to men outside of the military who connect their own masculinity to the ideals of these brave patriots. The reality of war is that the infantry is routinely marched into the battlefield only to be mowed down by machine gun and artillery fire, left to die an agonizing death with hardly a thought from their superiors as to who they were or how they died. The private, we should recall, derives from the same root as deprived and deprivation, and in the military context it means without rank or deprived of rank. A Marine Corps private wears no uniform insignia, yet in the myth bolstered by Private Ryan, the young enlisted man is so important that the highest ranks of the military order an elite squad of 8 men to risk their lives, indeed ultimately to give their lives, all 8 of them, for the sole purpose of finding and recovering him. The second truth that we should probably talk about is that soldiers are traumatized. In the aspirational military imagery of the tough, loyal soldier, there is little room for the mental impact of war on every person it touches. But the impact is there, gradually revealing itself over the decades as the study of human psychology collected the testimonies of war trauma as a serious consideration rather than an embarrassing individual inability to cope. PTSD, of course, is now commonly connected to military service in the eyes of the general public, and it was actually research into Vietnam veterans amongst survivors of other traumatic events, including sexual assault and genocide, that helped with the development of the diagnosis itself. Yet, I think many men who valorize the Hollywood image of the American soldier are unaware of the widespread nature of this trauma response and the true impact that it has on those who suffer with it. Though only 10% of American forces see combat, the US military now has the highest rate of post-traumatic stress disorder in its history. It's here that I want to point out again a very specific connection between our 3 genres of Hollywood men, and that is that the men of the 1950s were themselves likely to be veterans of one or both of the world wars, or directly involved in the conflicts of the 50s themselves. And those conflicts created levels of impact. There was, of course, the individual impact of the trauma of war on these men, but there was also the wider social impact of post-war uncertainty. Perhaps the biggest absurdity of the 1950s normativity was the fact that the norms of Cold War America, like its post-war prosperity, were totally anomalous. Most simply, Americans could not become cheerful exemplars of the joys of capitalism by returning to normal life because from a historical, social, social, technological, and especially demographic perspective, nothing about post-war America was normal. There is the potential for a huge amount of psychological disconnect between the experience of a soldier following orders that included killing other human beings to then being dropped into the suburban life of a husband in the 1950s who was expected to aspire to corporate career ladder climbing. Some never spoke about their experiences of war. Others attempted to write about them. And yet, writing about these realist war novels 20 years later, Alfred Kazin would argue that one can only say what Whitman said of the Civil War. The real war will never get into books. No individual experience, as reported in literature, can do justice to it, and the most atrocious common experiences will seem unreal as we read about them. The real war was so horrific, Kazin explains, that it is not actually possible to convey it realistically. Such were the horrors of World War II. Kazin continues that by the 50s, the liberal intellectuals' image of it was demolished, and that with so many new wars on the horizon, such a continued general ominousness, the war soon became war anywhere, anytime. War that has never ended. War as the continued experience of 20th century man. Ironically, this sense of uncertainty was heightened by the emergence of the Cold War of the era too, along with the paranoia of McCarthyism and the existential threat of nuclear devastation that had chased soldiers from the battlefield back into their homes. It was in the 50s that the DSM included gross stress reaction as connected to the types of severe war trauma that we now understand as PTSD, a condition that might manifest in explosions of anger, intense depression, horrifying flashbacks, fatigue and insomnia, amongst a host of other symptoms. So much for that idyllic 1950s man, right? As more American servicemen entered into combat, the number of psychological casualties steadily rose. During the Normandy campaign, Army psychologists noted that the combat effectiveness of troops sharply declined after 30 days of combat. After 45 days, troops were in a near vegetative state. Psychiatrist John Appel, who studied combat exhaustion cases during the Battle of Monte Cassino and Anzio campaign, came to the sobering conclusion that practically all men in rifle battalions who were not otherwise disabled ultimately became psychiatric casualties. Military medicine finally conceded that it wasn't a question of if a soldier would break in combat, but a question of when. But then the focus of helping these men became on ensuring that they could become useful members of society. Getting better meant becoming productive members of the workforce and regaining a sense of independence because it was key to their continued self-perception of their masculinity. As one congressman said, when the scope of the mental impact of the Second World War had on American veterans started to become more apparent, if they can have the right kind of psychiatric study and assistance and guidance and training during these first critical months of readjustment, most of them can become again self-supporting and self-respecting useful citizens. And finally, we have the third reality that I wanted to talk about in this section, which is that soldiers aren't the main character heroes. Most Hollywood portrayals of war would have you assume that American soldiers are not just the main characters in the movie sense, but that they are the only real complex and worthy humans involved in such conflicts. But of course, that isn't true. America is not the great bringer of freedom and democracy that it often pretends that it is. But it suits this idea of white American masculinity to believe that it is, because otherwise we're forced to reckon with basically the entirety of the American past, as well as its current foreign policies, in a way that opens up a can of false superiority worms that are difficult to deal with. Because if you think about the idea of war movies as a genre, right? Either they are actually all about war, in which case shouldn't war movies as a genre be welcoming films about the experiences of a diverse range of people and their experiences of war, or they're actually just pandering to a subset of men who are portrayed on screen who truly believe that killing people or being killed yourself is the most important thing that you can do for your country. Just like the popularity of the Western genre kept the notion of the Western hero alive and well in the American consciousness, we can also see how the continued use of patriotic depictions of war, especially those that utilize dehumanized Middle Eastern enemies, keep the American military's urgent necessity alive and well in that same American consciousness when it comes to long-term moral panic campaigns like the War on Terror. This commodification of America's trauma utilizes the constant perpetuation of the images and narrative of the attacks as a propaganda campaign deployed in order to constantly remind the American people of their government's current justification for imperialism and white exceptionalism. Westwell's analysis of Hollywood's output in the decade after the September 11th attacks is exhaustive and demonstrates a clear connection between the subtext of these films and the neoconservative agenda of the Bush administration. However, regardless of the political movement behind the propagandist agenda, whether it be neoconservatism, conservatism, republicanism, or Trumpism, the base ideology is always founded on a belief of the superiority of the white man. Because let's be real, this idea of soldiers as superior, especially morally superior, is itself demonstrably false. They are not more moral than any other American. In fact, the prevalence of things like military rape or the treatment of prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, for example, are pretty clear examples of why this simply isn't the case. And I guess finally in this section, I think it's just worth mentioning that if we're discussing this idea of American freedom being won by soldiers fighting in foreign countries, we got to acknowledge that this erases the myriad freedoms that have been kept from those who weren't straight white men within America itself over the centuries. You know, freedoms from slavery, from discrimination, from danger. Those were all things that were happening and inequalities that were being perpetuated within the country of America itself, even while these wars were being fought. And so we come to this final section, the subversion of the soldier hero. Let's dive into the movies that subvert the soldier hero narrative, if we can manage to find them. Where I think some of these attempts to subvert traditional pro-war movies fail is in the limitations of their subversion. For example, many seem to go down the route of American white men are victims of war. We're talking The Hurt Locker, An American Sniper, and Brothers. These movies argue that the PTSD and isolation that American soldiers and their families experience make them victims, which, yes, they are, but to quote the internet, who set that system up? It's hard to be an American soldier hardly seems to stand as a meaningful critique of American soldiers being held up as a masculine ideal. If anything, it simply reinforces the idea that being a white man in America is, in fact, simply the hardest thing that you can be. Alternatively, some war movies will hint at critiques of the American military itself, but ultimately don't go as far as to suggest that war itself might be bad. Just this particular instance of a certain kind of war, maybe. And even then, the soldiers themselves are, well, they're free to continue to be a masculine ideal. Three Kings, for example, mocks the United States' involvement in the Gulf War, but ultimately ends with its male leads being true Americans and saving Iraqi refugees. Zero Dark 30, on the other hand, can easily be viewed through a lens that critiques the American government's interrogation practices. But it can also be viewed through the lens of the US does what it has to. Either road you travel by, the film ends with a triumph of the American soul, as Osama bin Laden being dead because of American ingenuity and morality. So how do you subvert the war genre when the worship of the American soldier is such a strong part of people's belief system that even a supposedly anti-war film can be heralded as patriotic and pro-war? There is, of course, at least one war that is not thought of with patriotic zeal, which is in fact regarded as a tragic and wasteful disaster by a larger percentage of the population than maybe any other, and that is the Vietnam War. Surely movies about Vietnam are subverting these ideas, right? Well, looking at the many reviews of classics of this genre, it seems the pull of ingrained patriotism remains even in movies which have all of the ingredients of an obvious anti-war message. Apocalypse Now, for example, is heralded by many as an obvious anti-war film, capturing the hellish experience of soldiers during the conflict. And yet, others experience the majestic cinematography as beautiful glorification. In a meta moment, the war movie Jarhead includes a scene of soldiers getting excited about their own deployment by watching Apocalypse Now. Both movies actually had one of the same editors, and he's talked in interviews about how unsettling it was to realize that the movie he'd originally intended to be horrifying had in reality been seen so differently by the real soldiers that the Jarhead book and movie talks about.
The original intention in Apocalypse Now was for you to be excited but horrified at what you were looking. This is the attack, the Valkyries attack in the film, and in the intentions of the military people in the film, none of that mattered. It was simply, this is a visceral scene that is going to get the soldiers stirred up so that they're going to go into battle.
And of course, even when dealing with failures of military campaigns, there is still the logical loophole that these are not the failures of the soldiers. The soldiers are still heroes. The critique is therefore not of military masculinity, but of non-soldier politicians, decision makers, who themselves are not the right kind of masculine Americans. There are a few movies, however, that manage to tip the scale into more obviously anti-war for many people. Ironically, a notable one is Flags of Our Fathers, which was directed by known masculine American dude Clint Eastwood, who you might remember from the Western section of this video. The movie was based around the mythologization of the iconic flag-raising photograph. It grapples with a distinctly American wartime response that has our government and media transforming men into myths of war and glorifying them as heroes. The concept itself reveals the gaps between fiction and reality. The men in the image were not, in fact, the first to raise a flag there. They were just the ones whose image was popularized and ultimately used as war propaganda. Where the sweeping shots of Apocalypse Now have been seen to glorify the imagery of war, Eastwood is well aware that he can never fully portray the horror of war, not even by denying his audience the safety of a steady perspective. His film technique is not really intended to give us an accurate idea of what the soldiers experienced, but rather to disrupt our position to the extent that as we glimpse the horror of war, we must allow our imagination to falter before it. We must recognize the real events of war as something that we cannot know, something that cannot be understood or accepted or glamorized because it falls outside the bounds of what the human mind can sort into a coherent experience. Losing all of our reference points, as well as the capacity to interpret the information delivered by our senses, we might barely grasp for a moment the ultimate horror of living through an event that cannot be represented by words and images. Interestingly, the film actually directly engages with some of the falsehoods that I've covered in this video. One memorable scene towards the beginning of the film, for example, depicting a man falling overboard and into the churning ocean. The main characters are unable to save him, despite their efforts. So much for no man left behind, one mutters, as the fleet of ships thereon forge ahead without a care. The masculinity crisis. Okay, so where does all of this leave us? When I first started thinking about making this video, I thought the whole thing would be about how kind of silly it was that these myths of masculinity had become history through American movies. I thought, discussing the truth of these eras and pulling back the curtain on the reality of sexist inequality or racial violence or abuses of power by military forces on the global stage would end in a video where people might go, oh boy, yeah, no, that is pretty wild. I was just thinking about how hot Danny and Sandy looked at the end of Grease, but you're right, the 1950s aren't actually a time we want to revisit. Interesting. And this is borne out by people I've spoken to about this idea over the past almost decade now. People where I point out like, hey, you know that ideal of masculinity that you probably have in your head? Have you ever considered X, Y, and Z? And very quickly they go, oh no. Oh, that is interesting. Yeah, you should totally do that video. So I thought the video might even prompt people to ask, okay, well, if these are the men who created and shaped America, then what exactly have they shaped it into? We could acknowledge the lies at the heart of the shiny image of American masculinity past. We could talk about how in 1976, the year after Marlboro became the most popular cigarette in the United States, a British documentary called Death in the West juxtaposed Marlboro Man advertisements with 6 real cowboys from the American West who were dying from lung cancer caused by heavy smoking. Philip Morris sued to prevent the film's distribution. And then acknowledge how much this one example is almost a microcosm of everything that we've been discussing over the course of this video, right? Or we might look at reasons why so many men seem dissatisfied with their lives, maybe investigating the impact of our economic system, as some critics have suggested. At the center of the white guys' unfulfilling lives lie their relationships to the industrial or post-industrial economies that shape their opportunities, their work routines, their personal and social relationships, and their cultural assumptions. Or we could talk about how, yes, Hollywood provides us with this mythologizing of American past and power, but that the messaging of this mythology was first created by the society that Hollywood is embedded in. Heroes, as far as I could tell, were white, and not merely because of the movies, but because of the land in which I lived, of which movies were simply a reflection. Yeah, maybe when I first started thinking about this video, that might have been possible. But here's the thing. Looking at the wave of the manosphere influencers and MAGA loyalists and alt-right activists churning out messaging about their versions of an ideal American masculinity, it doesn't seem as simple. Because the inequalities and the violent nationalism and the unearned social power that white American masculinity was granted throughout this history that we've looked at, they are now the point. Ultimately, we're in a place where it's becoming increasingly apparent that these men pushing for a return to masculinity's past aren't ignoring the dark truths about these parts of American history, but actively want to return to them. And that is a crisis of masculinity that we are all going to have to reckon with. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you want to support the channel, then please consider checking out my Patreon and Ko-fi links. They are in the description. Patreon has a bunch of different perks that you can sign up for if you want to throw a little bit of change, a tip, if you will, my way in order to support the channel. It truly is the reason why I'm able to do what I do, and I am so unbelievably thankful for the community that's over there. If you don't have the financial means but still want to support the channel, then sharing this video, liking, commenting, all those things do make a difference to the dreaded algorithm. And I'm, as always, very appreciative of any support that people want to give. And as always, if you have any thoughts about anything within this video, please tell me about it in the comments. I am so blessed to have the most incredible comment section on my videos. The thought that people put into those comments is amazing. Kind of full essays people are writing there, which I can definitely relate to if you have noticed the length of this video. So thank you once again for watching, and until I see you next time, bye.